Hello and welcome to the Nitty Gritty Writing Podcast. I'm Simon Cantan.
And I'm Dave Higgins.
And today we're going to be talking about what we'd do if we were starting all over again. But before we do that, we're going to do our usual weekly roundup of what we've been up to. And Dave, you can go first.
Right. Another episode of Seven Stones bashed out. About a third of the way through the next draft of Origin, the first volume of the Dragons and Magic series I'm co-writing with Simon. And I've got some vague ideas for a story that I've been asked to pitch for an anthology in September. So that's relatively well. Apart from that, last minute EU referendum deliveries and spending Friday bashing my head against a wall.
Yeah, and then I saw people are panicking now and saying, hey, wait, what? I didn't realize I was actually voting to leave.
Yeah. It's
Never
not
mind.
gone brilliantly.
No, not really. Especially the Leave crowd are now taking back all of their promises /
Yeah.
whatever pledges. But yeah, anyway, for me, I have been writing the Fields of Dust, the post-apocalyptic book. I wrote about 15,000 words this week. 5K of that was today because I realized in my Scrivener file that I had included the product description and some other stuff in the compile check marks, which meant that I thought I was on 30K and I was actually on 29K or something. So I was actually a bit behind. And day job has just been ridiculous this week as well. It's been ridiculous for a month and a half at least. So yeah, so that was what I did. I don't think I did anything else particularly interesting on writing wise. So we can get straight onto our topic. So what we would do if we were starting again. I'm taking that to mean since we published rather than since we were little kids and decided we want to be writers, because that would be a long way back to go.
Yeah.
So I guess my personal kind of things I would want to kind of fix, I guess, about my early career, where it was outlining, I guess, would be a good one. Having a good plan going in. It's very difficult to know because a lot of what I know now has come from experience of making the mistakes. And the mistakes I've made, or the things that are mistakes for me, are not necessarily mistakes for someone else. So, for instance, on the Bitter End series, the second book is 2 novellas and a short story, whereas it should really be a novel, because all the other books are novels. However, other people have been massively successful with novellas. It's not like novellas in themselves are unsuccessful. Another thing might be that the first book kind of doesn't start out with the story that it's going to finish telling. So it starts out with kind of an origin story for the 2 main characters. And it's about 10,000 words in, or maybe a little bit more, that they actually leave where they are and go to Bitter End, where they're actually going to start fighting against the baddies. So I've heard from multiple people that they're saying, oh, I'm glad I stuck with it, because then it finally got going at about a quarter of the way through the book. So that'd be certainly a mistake in terms of books. How about you, Dave?
I think two things really I'd like to do, and one of them is take my writing seriously faster. I decided I was good at it at the point I won a competition. And so that made me think, well, okay, I can actually do it. It could be more than a hobby. But from there to actually submitting things to calls took a long time, comparatively speaking. And I'd been winning free to enter, no prize, purely the kudos of placing competitions for a while before I started submitting anything. So if I was going to do it again, potentially I'd take that buzz off placing first in a competition and turn that towards winning in a more metaphysical sense, rather than just entering competitions to win competitions when that wasn't getting anywhere. None of those stories are really going to cause someone to come across them and think, "Ooh, I'll buy his book," because whilst they're good, they don't have a connection. So they didn't actually do anything other than give me a buzz of, well, yes, you can still write well. So if I maybe off the first or second time I did well, started submitting at that point, I'd have got off faster. And second thing is what I might have written right at the very start. Because like you, I've learned a lot from the things that didn't work for me. But I learnt outlining, pacing myself with a series of intermediate goals and so on by hacking through a couple of trunk novels where I wrote it and it's not good. And so I tried to fix it. And it's better, but it's still not good. Whereas if I'd done more short stories, then I could learn outlining and fixing from short stories without getting stuck in the, well, actually the lessons I've got from the months it took over a novel aren't any better or more meaningful than the lessons I'd have gotten from writing a 10,000 word story. And I could have done several 10,000 word stories in the time it takes to write the first draft of a novel with no outline and no intermediate milestones and so on. So it's sort of, and also that would have fitted with my other goal of trying to submit more faster. Trying to submit a novel, you've got to get the novel great. Whereas submitting short stories, you can write the short story faster, fix it up to the point where it is actually good faster. And that was something that I could do. And if I'm winning short story competitions, admittedly tiny ones with no real zazz to them, then I'm still okay at short stories at least, whereas I've never done a novel before. So going from I'm doing okay at writing short stories, so I'll write 100,000 word novel, was not necessarily the perfect decision. I mean, if it had worked out, it would have been great. But if we're applying hindsight, I might have been better spending that time doing short stories instead.
Yeah, I mean, Chris Fox mentioned something on his latest video where he said that if you're trying to learn to play the trumpet, you shouldn't take an entire piece and play it from start to finish, which might take 10 minutes. And then play all of it badly. You should take the first bar of music, keep practicing that over and over until it's actually good, which would be the same as your short stories that you would take. So if you have something that you're not particularly good at, you take it in a short story and you can keep working on it until you think it's good, or you can abandon it and go on to the next short story. Whereas if you try and practice something in a novel, that's a long thing to have to work on just to practice a particular thing that you're trying to get better at. It's something I've never particularly mastered, is short stories. I've never been very good at them.
It's strange. It's a strange market, as it's not a market to write for career necessarily. It's it's a niche within a niche for short stories, really, because most people don't buy collections of short stories. So maybe you can get a short story into a magazine, but magazines aren't the same market as books, and the word rate for magazines isn't necessarily as profitable as what you can get from publishing a book and having it on Amazon and having lots of people buy it. Because there isn't that people say, oh yes, last month's edition of Omni was great, and so lots of people go out to buy Omni and they like it, and they mention to their friends that last June's issue of Omni was great, and so you should seek that out. So short stories aren't something that it's worth mastering unless you happen to like them. So if you like writing short stories, if you like reading short stories, I think they're something that's fun, and they're a good way to deal with the hundreds of ideas boiling through your head stage, where you've got all these things you want to do. So you can do the Ray Bradbury idea of writing lots and lots and lots of short stories, and then some of them would work.
Yeah. So I would say that, going back again to first books and that kind of thing, definitely writing short stories for practice is a great idea. And I think trying to find a place where you get very unconnected feedback, I would say, like not a friend or a family member, but someone who's not connected to you, but also not a writer. So I had trouble where I was in a writers group for years, where they were picking apart sentence structure and stuff, which was of no use to anyone. Really, what you want is this a good story? As long as it's readable. I mean, if you're putting 5 verbs in a row, obviously that's not going to work. But if it's legible and someone can read it, and maybe it's colloquial. I read a book this week, a very, very short little thing, where the commas weren't correct, and he made loads of mistakes and all that kind of stuff. There was lots of spelling mistakes, but it was a funny book, so I didn't really care that there was lots of mistakes in it. It didn't really matter. And if that's the case, I mean, you're going to get some people who would hate that same book because it wasn't correct grammar and that kind of thing. But if it entertains people, then isn't that the main thing, at least at the start? At the very start of a writing career, you want to be entertaining people so that they come back and read more of your stuff. I think that is a kind of a good goal. Don't try and start out and be George R. R. Martin or whatever and change the whole world. Try to, master the first step, which is to be entertaining. So the other thing I was going to mention was, in terms of writing techniques in general, to have paid more attention to certain things that I learned, that I heard early, and then haven't really practiced deliberately. So one thing that I read ages and ages ago was that Quentin Tarantino used to write scripts that were terrible, and then his scripts started being good when he started writing not what the people were saying, but what the subtext was, and they would just have a conversation on top of that. Where his so someone was mentioning this on a YouTube video that in Reservoir Dogs they have an argument at the start of the movie about paying a tip, and all of the characters, the way that they react is exactly the way that they react then under pressure during the heist gone wrong later. So Mr. Orange, for instance, is for paying the tip exactly the amount it's meant to be and all that kind of thing, because is it a spoiler? I guess, I mean, they kind of reveal it anyway. Maybe a spoiler for Reservoir Dogs if you haven't seen the 30-year-old movie. That that he's a cop, so he's being, straightforward and honest and whatever. And then when Joe comes back and asks who didn't tip, Mr. Orange goes, Mr. Pink didn't tip, because he's the cop. So he's like, as soon as authority turns up, he says exactly what is happening. So yeah, so that was quite interesting, that, and something I could have learned a lot earlier, and haven't really practiced it enough to say I'm any good at it, of having a conversation about something else that demonstrates character, that shows the underlying character of the people in your story. So that was one thing, at least. I think, as a general rule, to have put more emphasis on learning as well. But so early on, I read some books on writing. But I would say that I read maybe 3 to 5 books on writing. And I should have been reading 25 to 50 books on writing. Because that's the other thing, is that you need to gain a perspective of the fact that writers all write in a different way. So you'd get the first guy saying, I outline, and the next guy saying that I pants, and the next person saying that they outline, and vice versa, and all doing it in different ways. A lot of these books have been out a long time, so it's not like, they're new books in the last 5 years or anything. They were available in the 80s and 90s. And that would have been very useful as well, early on, even before I published, to have gotten more perspective on writing, and the fact that you should pick out the things that work for you and not the things that don't. So that's one side. The other side, I would say, is marketing, and that's a more recent, I think, learning possibility. So I did the Nick Stevenson course last year, which I've mentioned before, and what I'm realizing in the last few months or so is that what he was teaching was tactics. So this is something that self-publishing podcast guys say over and over: focus on strategy and not tactics. So he mentions Facebook ads, which are a tactic for getting either more sales or more readers, whatever it happens to, more subscribers, whatever it happens to be. But that's a tactic, and that can change tomorrow. Or keywords, which we worked on quite a bit for Green Star, which worked gangbusters for a while, and then Amazon decided to crack down on it, and now they don't work at all, which is another tactic. Whereas there's certain things I think you can focus on, which then aren't subject to changes in Amazon's algorithms, or Facebook, or anything like that. That if you write books that are compelling enough and unique enough and aligned enough with what people want to read, that then you will get readers eventually. I mean, it might take you 20 books by the time you're starting to pick up interest, but people will want to read authors who have something unique to say, something interesting to say, and say it in an interesting, very readable way. I would say. What do you think, Dave?
I think definitely I'd have started the being interesting sooner, as potentially we disagree about how powerful it is, but I know several successful authors who a big part of their marketing and sales strategy is being interesting, just being interesting as a person publicly on social media or whatever, and then that gets a certain proportion of people to think, hey, they're an interesting person, I wonder what else they do. Find the list of books on their Facebook profile, the link in their Twitter that takes them to the books page on the website, whatever. And then they'll think, hey, if it's an interesting person in real life, maybe their books are interesting. So I don't like social media. I don't dislike social media, but I'm old enough that I can remember when the internet wasn't a thing. I can remember getting my first website. I think it was GeoCities Tripod, one of those, where it was basically you FTP'd HTML files up and it created this wonderful blocky thing. It looks nothing like the websites today with all of the snaz they've laid on the top. But so I didn't grow up with the internet as something that you had in your pocket. So it's always been an effort for me to bring the internet in, particularly as I don't have a use for a mobile phone. So I don't have the internet in my pocket even now. If I want to check out the internet when I'm not going to be at home, I have to plan ahead, take a laptop with me, find somewhere with Wi-Fi, rather than just pulling my phone out. So potentially, given that I write my stories based on things that interest me, I think a lot of authors do, that my stories mostly come from, I wonder what, or how would it be if? So possibly if I pushed harder to get over that first hurdle of just not being on social media at all when I started writing, I could have built more of a social media presence on the ones that do actually work at all without a mobile phone, at least. And then potentially I'd have had more people who weren't connected to me closely, my friends, members of societies, writers I knew from writing groups and so on, who would have been interested in my first publications. So when I suddenly found a publishing project landing on my lap, I could have gone, wow, this has happened. I'm not quite sure what's going on, but I'm going to give it a try. And there'd already be people who are going to go, wow, that sounds interesting. Like, let me know how it's going. And then you've got people who are interested. Because it's very, very true that there's only a certain amount of selling a product you can do before the product exists. So kickstarting books goes a little bit wonky if it's, I'd like to earn £10,000 so I can take 2 months off work to write this book or whatever. But if you can get people interested in you as a person and then bring them into the book, then they're there for the book when you release it. So I think
I would say there's definitely, I mean, you see that the number one books are always the celebrity books. Like Jordan brings out a book and it's number one in the charts. Because, as you say, people are interested in her as a person. And I have not read any of Jordan's books. What I would guess that they are ghostwritten and not something that I would be particularly interested in. But for the people who are interested in Jordan, then that's a link to her as a person. I'm probably disparaging her with no reason. Maybe she wrote the books herself.
I don't know. It's not the kind of thing I cared enough to find out.
But to your point that a connection with a person leads to the sale of a book, that would be a very obvious example of that, where it's not necessarily the quality of the book that's drawing people in. It's the wanting that the people feel they have a connection with Jordan already and they want to read what her book is in order to feel closer to her as a person. So they like her and they want to find out more.
Yeah, it's my first. The defining characteristic of when I started writing for more than just entertainment was, right, I'm going to write a really great thing. It's going to be well written. It's going to be interesting. And I didn't have any idea when I started that writing a great book doesn't help you sell a great book. And if your book is utter trash and you don't have any kind of celebrity, your book isn't going to be saleable. But it's not a reversible relationship. If you write a really great book, that doesn't immediately mean it's going to sell. So potentially I've focused more on the marketing side, on understanding what you need in addition to being able to write well.
I think so. This is a recent thing. So Chris Fox has his right to market thing, where you try and look for a market where things are selling, and then you find out what the tropes are in that market, and then you write that kind of book, which definitely works. I mean, people are looking for more of the same quite often. But something I heard from Dan Harmon, I think, who writes Community, the TV show, he was saying that the way he thinks about writing a new series is he imagines he's watching TV and he's absolutely loving it. And he tries to think about what his reactions are when he's loving that TV show. And then he tries to turn the camera around and show what's actually on the screen. What is it that he's watching that's causing that reaction? And I think that's an interesting thing also from a book perspective, to think of extreme reactions and what actually makes something an interesting book. Because I think quite often the temptation is to ape our favorite authors. So rather than coming up, like, a lot of what I like about science fiction is reading a story that's nothing like I've ever read before, where the situation in the science fiction story, like The Martian is a good example. The Martian is not something I'd ever read something similar to before. I've read a lot of sci-fi where it's set in the future and there's space stations and all that kind of stuff. But this is a near future, and there's no aliens or vengeful gods or anything coming to get them. It's just, can I science my way out of this difficult situation? And that's kind of, I think, where I am, and where I would look to be if I was starting again would be to write something that's entirely unique while still fitting within a certain genre, if that makes any sense at all. So the book I'm writing at the moment, for instance, is post-apocalyptic fiction, but it's not exactly Mad Max, and it's got so I've noticed that certain things are similar to Hunger Games, but it's not exactly that either. Like, I wouldn't say that it fits something I've read before, at least. Whilst it still has enough elements from that genre that you could definitely say it's post-apocalyptic, and it has, a world without water and without certain things, and people are living in desperate situations and things like that. But it's not Mad Max. So yeah, I think that's certainly something I've been thinking about recently. How to be unique whilst remaining within the bounds of a genre enough that you can sell it afterwards.
Mm.
The other thing that I've learned recently is how important the tagline is for something. The one sentence elevator pitch. Like Speed is always the famous example, Die Hard on a bus. Or Alien in space, No One Can Hear You Scream. Or Omega Man had a good one. The Last Man on Earth is Not Alone. That's a good tagline. That's another thing that's quite important and should be figured out before you even start writing an outline, I think. It's something that I haven't done with recent books. The book I'm writing at the moment, I didn't have a tagline. I've come up with one now that I'm so happy with, which is they'd kill to have kids. Together with like a post-apocalyptic thing, I think might make people at least check out the description. It's kind of, I think, kind of gives a kind of a horror-y kind of feel to it, or something like that, like a that kind of thing. But that's my current one. I reserve the right to change it for something better. So that's another thing I definitely do differently if I was starting again now, is come up with the way that I'm going to hook people the very first time they ever see anything about that book. Why would they even check it out? If it's on social media, for instance, you would want it to be something that they look at, that they find, say they're following you on social media, and they see that one sentence and they go, oh, I knew this was going to be good. And then they go and check it out. Or someone who doesn't even know you sees an ad or sees someone sharing it and goes, that's interesting. I wonder what that's about. And goes and checks it out. Because a big part of being an author these days is fighting obscurity. I think. So what do you think, Dave, on that?
Yeah, it is obscurity. It's finding a way to. I don't know if writing the tagline before you do anything else is right. As for me, I don't know what the book's about until I've written it. So writing a tagline would be tying myself into, okay, so now it's going to be a book about children. And people who'd kill for them. And that might
But-
not be how the book turns out.
No, but you said earlier that you start with a question.
Yeah.
So it would be interesting if, or what would happen if, or something like that. So it's that question of phrasing that question in a way that would get people to go, "Oh, I want to find out about that."
Oh, yes, that's not necessarily going to be there at the end. If I wrote a story about what would happen if you had a society that gave medical aid to its enemies during lulls in the battle, the story that came out of that question was a science fiction story about refugees. So it had nothing to do with giving medical aid to enemies. So if I'd written the tagline at that point, the story would either have been locked in and wouldn't have turned out to be the story that I ended up writing, or it would have been a tagline that didn't do anything. So I don't know if locking your tagline down at that point would work for me.
Again, that's down to every author being different. I mean, I would say that the last two books that I've written, the vampire book and the post-apocalyptic one, that I knew at least what the premise was for the books. I didn't know any of the details because I'm now doing this outline a bit and then write a bit and then outline a bit and then write a bit. So I don't really know how things are going to end. Even now, I'm at 35,000 words through this post-apocalyptic book. I don't know how it's going to end. I have an inkling, but I've found it's actually better not knowing, because then if something's a surprise for me, it's a surprise for the reader. At least that's the hope. But I at least know the premise of what the conflict is, why these characters are going to get into this situation. So the situation that they're in this book is that they're all infertile, and the only way to get fertile is to play in this game, which is, full contact, people die and people get maimed and all that kind of thing. So that's kind of the hook to it, but not necessarily the story. It could go anywhere in the story. I don't even know now where the story will end. They might win the tournament, they might lose the tournament, they might not finish the tournament. I don't know. So I wouldn't say they're going to win this tournament as a tagline, because I don't know. But I would say what their motivation is, because I know that much at least. So yeah, as I say, every author is different. If you're really pantsing, where you don't even know who the characters are, what the plot is, or anything, then I would say you're right. You're completely right. It's impossible to come up with a tagline because you don't know what the story is. Yeah. Anything else that you do differently? Covers we've mentioned lots of times.
Yeah, I'm not going over things necessarily we've done a whole video on.
Yeah.
And sticking more money into projects right at the start, maybe. Once you know that you're going to have 5 books under your belt and people are going to like them, it's a lot easier to say, oh yes, well clearly I should have dropped a couple of £100 on a cover right at the very start. But I don't think that might be a psychological step too far for people who aren't looking back. Is where I was at that point. It looks like a completely different investment.
I would say not to look at it on it as a financial investment as much as a way to get. So the point of us writing Some people are writing just for financial return.
Mm.
In which case, I would presume that they're doing some kind of market research before they even put down word one, and would know that there's a good chance that they're going to make money on whatever the book they're writing. But a lot of us are writing because we're readers and like the idea of having our own books with our name on the cover and so on. And if you look on the professional cover as being a way to end up with a book that looks professional, that it could stand beside other books on your shelves and look exactly like they do. Whereas if you do the cover yourself, it's never going to look as good as that. We're not professional cover designers. So rather than, like, a couple of £100 sounds like a lot of money, but really it's not when you compare it to other hobbies. If it's obviously not a hobby, or we hope it's not going to be a hobby eventually, but there's plenty of guys in work that have motorbikes or boats or whatever, and they invest far more than a couple of £100 in theirs. And if a book is taken 6 months or a year or whatever, however long it's taken to write, investing a couple of £100 in a cover, even if the book never sells at all, just so you have a copy yourself for your bookshelf that looks like a proper book and you can give it out to family and friends, I think is worth the investment. With the advantage of then it has a proper cover on Amazon and people are more likely to buy it and read it. Like, it's a tough thing to do if money is tight, I think, because it can almost feel like an indulgence to pay for a proper cover, because as a group in general, writers tend to underappreciate their own artistry, their own worth, and say, yeah, but it's just something I sat down and wrote, so it can't be worth the proper cover. It can't be worth a couple of $100 or a professional edit or whatever it happens to be. But any of there's plenty of books behind me there, any of those authors felt the same. George R. R. Martin was in an interview with Stephen King this week saying that he often feels like a fraud. He's been writing for decades and decades, and he's got the most popular books in the world, and yet he says he feels like a fraud. So I think we need to, intellectually at least, even if emotionally we can't, realize that we're just as worth a proper cover as any other author is. And if money is tight, it is possible to save over a number of months or even a year or whatever it happens to be. So a cover from 99 Designs, for instance, is $300. So that's whatever divided by 12. Like, it is possible to save that amount of money if you tried, especially people drinking Starbucks coffee and things like that. $25 a month over a year. It's not too steep. So yeah, that would be my thoughts. Even if it's your first ever book. My first ever book, The Bite in the Line, has a proper cover. Granted, then I made the mistake of, for the next one, of not having a proper cover, and quite a lot of them after that. Yeah. And then I've gotten to the stage now where for some of the books, I feel like I can even do the cover because I'm branding it rather than trying to get something artistic. So that's something we've talked about before as well, so there's no need to really go into it. Just look at our video on covers. But branding something that so it looks exactly like 50 other books in that category is possible. I think the practice I've put into GIMP and graphic design has had something to play there, that I can actually manage to do something simple. So what else? Trying to think of anything else we might have missed.
No, things I do differently. No, I can't think of anything else. Racking my brains to think back. And a lot of the things I do again, because after decades of law, I have the habit of researching the admin bits before I commit to them. So administratively speaking, setting up the various accounts, getting my tax affairs in order, starting to track all of my expenses before I needed to ever tell anyone what my expenses were, I put in place. So it's the specifics to writing bits that got me. I think so. I've focused more on writing short stories and submitting them sooner, rather than sticking with I'm good at this. Hey, I'll submit to another competition that's not going to do anything other than get me the buzz of having won the competition. Yeah.
I think as well, another thing I'd mention is zigging when other people are zagging, or at least thinking about the fundamentals underlying the things that you're doing. So what you're mentioning about competitions, where the fundamental is your thinking at the time was, this competition is going to get me further or get me nearer to my goal, or whatever it happens to be, or even just give me the kind of buzz of winning a competition. There's plenty of fundamentals that we just take for granted, that are possible to play with, and the people who play with them are the ones that tend to be the most successful. Obviously, there's a good chance of failure as well, but trying to follow the gold rush people isn't really working, at least not as far as I've seen, because we tend to be too many steps behind. Like, for instance, I saw an author today posting an ad, or posting to their feed, it wasn't even a paid ad, saying, as good as blah book, click here to find out, which I have now seen hundreds, if not thousands of times, and readers have started complaining about, it's something Nick Stevenson was teaching last summer when I signed up for his course, and at that point it was starting to oversaturate, and now it's just old news. So you need to come up with something that, like George R. R. Martin was another good example, where his books, the heroes can die, and that's a fundamental of writing that most other people weren't considering. Like, you can go back to Alfred Hitchcock, obviously, but in most cases, most people would write a story where the hero wins and everyone's happy. And George R. R. Martin said, no, okay, my heroes are going to die, and then realized, I think, that meant that his books had to be much, much better than the other books in the genre. He had to carefully structure it so that you weren't just following a single person, because then when they die, then the reader stops. Yeah. So there's a very kind of careful balancing there in order to get past that. So you can think of a fundamental of writing and work out how you can potentially bypass it, or think of a fundamental of marketing, and how you could do it differently that would actually be more effective. And even if it's not, if it fails, I mean, the majority of people who are following after the people who have been successful are going to fail anyway, because it's old hat. You're talking about thousands and thousands of writers who are all watching the same podcast, or listening to the same podcast, and watching the same videos, and doing the same things. So yeah, was there anything else you wanted to add at the end there, Dave?
Don't think so. No, and I just another question. No questions written in.
There was a lot of comments from Anita actually. I'll just go back to them. We were just discussing. Children's books and the fact that they're incredibly difficult to sell. Even more difficult than maybe short stories are. So yeah, that was from our previous podcast. And yeah, we were discussing different ideas of things that can be done in that realm. So a shout out to Anita as always. And yeah, unless there was anything else, we can end there.
Can't think of anything now.
Grant, thank you all very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.